My name's right here, so I'll stay here. Hi. Um, so why don't we just move down our table of panels there. Phil, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you're up to?
Hi, I'm Phil Brown. I'm at Northeastern University. I'm director of a center called SERI, the Social Science and Environmental Health Research Institute, and we have lots of collaborations between environmental health scientists, sociologists, anthropologists, and science and technology studies people. And what I want to just say a few words about is the question of reporting back data to participants in environmental health studies, which is work I've been doing for quite a while. Uh, so this is to advance it?
Yeah, it's up.
So you'd be surprised, actually, how few studies report data back to people. And that was our starting point. So our team, which involves people at where I was before at Brown, at Berkeley, now at Northeastern, and Silent Spring Institute, we did a series of projects. We started with a household exposure study and a biomonitoring study in Cape Cod and extended that to Northern California. And it was really only after our participants on Cape Cod said, when are we going to get the data back, that we originally thought, oh, you have to do that. Began to see that there were a few other people doing that work. It became for us very quickly a central part of it. But nevertheless, even today, most environmental health studies do not report data back to people. So it's a kind of helicopter research where you go in and you take data from people, but you don't give it back. In our studies, we did that with slides I'll show you more of after I say a few more words. And we found that it was really important and easy. It was good science. It was good community collaboration. It helped recruit people. It helped retain people into studies. It helped community groups to be empowered to find access to more resources afterwards. And it was ethically the only way that we considered this was possible. We found that IRBs, for instance, were reluctant to allow this. We had to convince our own IRB at Brown to allow this. Other people at BU, they did a PBDE study. They were only allowed to do passive report back, where they gave people phone number, call us if you want your data. Nobody called because they were afraid. They're low-income people. They're not used to calling up physicians and PhDs and saying, could you talk to me about my data? In our studies, we did home visits. We mailed materials to people. We knocked on the doors. We made appointments to speak with them. And we had about a 99% response to people wanting to hear their data. And on top of that, because we're social science oriented, we also interviewed them about what they had learned, what they expected to do with that data, how they made sense of it. So we got a full gamut of questions about how they experienced it, what they thought the causes were, what concerns they had for their and their family's future illness. The more we did this, the more we found that people wanted us to talk about it. And it wasn't just our studies anymore. It was like we decided, let's go out and find some other biomonitoring studies where people are reporting back and talk to them about what they, as researchers, what their IRBs and what the participants felt about making the decision to share that data and to receive that. Eventually, our team wound up helping Biomonitoring California to design their own report back. They were the first state agency of their sort, after sort of a mini NHANES. But they were mandated to report back, which NHANES is not. And our team was working with them to actually design that. So we were now not only evaluating, but we were doing report back designs. And we did this also for the CHDS, which people may used to know as 3Gs, three generation studies, now childhood development studies. We also have been doing this with a CDC Healthy Housing Project in Boston and Cincinnati. And we're doing that with our Northeastern Superfund Research Program, which works on preterm birth in Puerto Rico. So the idea is that we've extended from doing it ourselves to studying how others do it to actually designing and producing a report back for people. Again, we still find there's a lot of resistance. We worked with a community group in Alaska, an EJ group called Alaska Community Action on Toxics. They were actually prohibited from even doing the research on PBDEs, on PCBs in breast milk, because they were told that, if you do this, the women won't breastfeed. And all the research that had been done to date showed that women informed of toxicants in their breast milk did not refuse to breastfeed. And if it was a hypothetical for future, they didn't say that they would refrain as well. Nevertheless, it's really kind of profound how powerful the resistance is. So right now we're at the point where we now get asked by other groups to help them figure out what to do with reporting data back. So there's a group called Testing for Peas in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They're one of about 600 military sites across the country with PFAS contamination. They're upset because the state of New Hampshire has taken blood but is not giving data back to people in appropriate ways, is not sharing it, is not aggregating it. So we're working with them to do further testing. We get asked by an African-American women's reproductive health group, Resilient Sisterhood Project, to do similar things. And our team is now developing, through Silent Spring, projects using this Detox Me Action Kit, where people can get mailed a kit. They give urine and test for 10 contaminants. And that data is not only given back to them, but through the use of various kinds of apps, we form both virtual and hopefully living communities where people actually share this data together. Again, it's an opt-in, no one's forced to do this, but increasingly people do want to do that. So I don't want to say too much more, just to show you, this is what it looks like when we give the material to people. This is a guide to reading results. We show people where their individual result is for each contaminant, where it relates to the rest of the sample, where it relates to state and federal levels, if there are any. And how's this moving ahead?
Can you move the slide back there? Oh, there we go.
All right. So yeah, this is one example of after they've learned how to read their results. This is one of the charts that we give them. Going the wrong direction. It just seems to want to be going back to these two. All right, here's another example. All right, so you want to just move it ahead. This is another example, which is one of those California biomonitoring studies. They're slightly different here, but basically the idea is the same. You see where you are in relation to the rest of the population. Next slide. This is another thing that we do in order to make sure that people understand it well. This is, we think, a fairly short narrative. We then do usability testing with people, and we reduce it on the next slide to about half as many words, because people in that usability testing focus group environment say, that was too much information for us, let's do it shorter. Next slide. And this is what we've been doing for the CHDS report. It's getting more refined. This is the narrative for it. Next slide. You see, they actually wanted to have horizontal rather than vertical graphs, so people that we work with can kind of define how they would like that to look. So it's a fairly different look, and we continually titrate this to meet the needs of other groups. And next slide. What we have done is to put together a booklet, a handbook that you can get on the Silent Spring Institute website that goes through all the stuff I've been telling you in great detail, gives lots of examples of how to do this. And that's going to be continually updated. I think there might be one more slide. That's it. No, that's it.
Okay, Phil, thank you very much. Thanks. Okay, we have Dawn Nafis, and I'm really intrigued by her being from Intel and an anthropologist at Intel. So
it's a pretty weird job. As David said, I'm an anthropologist who works in the R&D labs of Intel, my job is really to try to understand why technologies do or don't matter to people. And so in the service of that, I spent a lot of time with this group called Quantified Self, which is a community of people who gather together to talk about the data that they collect. So a lot of the experiments, looked roughly like some of the things that we saw today, although often less extreme. And so, they'll use wearables, they'll do pen and paper, right? And they get together face to face, actually, in a real community. And one reason you might want to participate in that community is that it turns out that keeping track is particularly useful when clinical medicine meets its limitations, right? So for example, if you've been recently diagnosed with migraines, if you're a chronic migraine sufferer, right, you can discover that in a clinic, but then discovering actually what the triggers are for you specifically is a different matter entirely. And that's a matter of day-to-day life, and it turns out that data is a pretty, useful tool in trying to sort that out. So, as an anthropologist, of course, I get embedded and participate actively. And, as part of that, I did a couple of things managing my own health. For example, I kept track of when I was having a particular literally a pain in my neck, and discovered what the triggers were for that. I also used a Fitbit, actually it wasn't a Fitbit, it was a Basis, sorry, for the process of relearning how to walk. I spent a number of months in a wheelchair, and the steps numbers actually helped me calibrate my recovery in a way that you wouldn't necessarily expect. So all of these methods, it turns out, the methods that I learned in QS, it turns out are really good when you happen to be at the long tail of the bell curve, and when it's something that's individually controllable. Now, the problem comes, and where we start to hit limitations with this sort of approach, is when the issues are bigger than one person, right? Or they're social, or other things are going on. And I think that limitation and that kind of sort of encounter is extremely useful for thinking about what we might mean when we talk about personal choice, when we talk about individual decision making, right? What do we really mean by that phrase? So an example of why I'm asking that question, it comes from, again, a personal story. I, like a good, quantified selfer, I went off and bought myself a PM 2.5 sensor, put it in my house, only to discover that a few months later that a factory down the road from me was spewing large amounts of cadmium and lead. So you can imagine that, so the Silicon Valley preference for designing these tools is not just to offer up data, right? What they want to do is offer up recommendations and insights, right? So the data is just a platform for their algorithms to deliver this stuff. So you can imagine in the kind of the traditional Silicon Valley, sort of design ethos, right? The recommendation would have been, oh, you should open your windows, which of course is the last thing you should do if you're living with a bunch of cadmium in the air, right? So, right, so this ethos, I think, becomes, as a real social problem, right? It's a social problem in the sense that what it's effectively doing is it's scoping a kind of, putting a fence around what we mean by, individual action, right? Where individual action is always sort of open and close the window, put the fan on, right? All of that stuff. And individual action, surprisingly, is never talk to your neighbors about it and actually try to get to the root cause of the problem, right? Funny that that's never in, IoT devices, right? So I can complain about that because I hope I'm in safe company. Right, so I said, look, we can't, pretend that we can sit here and sort of elide, right, political contestation. Right? That's not going to happen if really we're going to, meaningfully start to fix problems. And so I started asking the question then, where does the personal sit, right, in a kind of a broader social context, right? And it turns out that, my experience in QS was such that people really do get involved in their data when it pertains very directly to them, right? And so I started asking questions. Okay, well, what can we do with that? And so I started exploring this notion of data as kind of a personal data as a mobilization tool, right? A way of putting together a picture, right, when other resources may or may not be there. And so I approached a community group. This is not local to me, and they have a point source polluter that they're worried about. And I said, look, we've got plenty of real-time health sensors, right? You've seen the laundry list of possibilities already. You guys have really good real-time air quality monitoring, right? They're getting once every 5 minutes, a variety of parameters, right? It's good stuff. My lab I'm actually co-leading a technical project called DataSense, which is an online software tool that you're looking at now, which um, is a way of sort of making it possible to work with and wrangle time series data, right, if you don't have data science skills and you're not interested in learning how to code, right? So with DataSense, it's pretty much 4 or 5 clicks to make an API call to get some air quality data and to upload your Fitbit data, right? This stuff isn't hard anymore. And so, so I said, look, we've got the tools. Let's just try the darn stuff out and see what we can see. And so we did. We made a pilot, a very small pilot. And, one of the things that I learned from that pilot is that the personal features in some very interesting ways, right? So sometimes, personal data was sort of reframing what it is people already knew, right? So they would say things like, when I'm in the area, I feel kind of crappy and sort of vaguely terrible, but I leave for 3 days and I start to feel different. And, we could look at that and say, oh, geez, that's your blood oxygen, right? And I sat down literally person by person in this interactive interface, sort of trawling through this data with them. We also had other, occasions where people were sort of, seeing sort of temporal recurrences and saying, oh, okay, well, maybe some of this, my stuff has to do with air quality, but sometimes not, right? And so we could do that meaning-making work together. And I kind of wanted to end on, which is why I wanted to show a slide, with some group work, right? So what we said was, this is the part of DataSense that will do, straightforward correlations. It was actually built for people who keep track of multiple parameters, right? So the idea was, the machine would crunch through lots of them and you could sort of see, oh, maybe something's related here, but probably not here. When you've got, lots of parameters to work with, that's useful to kind of do visually. So instead, we loaded in, kind of every participant here and sort of correlated it with a substance. Now I've obfuscated this because this is not my story to tell in many ways, and these are not findings that you should take seriously, in kind of a broad sense. But as a kind of a methodological point, right, sort of each person, these are pairwise correlations, right, so each person is sort of correlating with, substance A over here, and you can see that they tend to mean, negative correlations. And what this enabled us to do, rather than to say just broadly, yes, there's a correlation, there's a relationship, right? But actually sort of separate that out as individuals, but, with personal names and so forth removed, is we could have this small group conversation about, well, is that really because, okay, well, those folks over, I'm kind of old, I've got asthma, is there a difference between healthy people and not healthy people? Is it, people who live closer to the point source polluter versus away, right? You could have a kind of a more embodied conversation about that stuff, but still sort of, cohere around a group, right, that can then sort of do something a little bit more effective than open the window. That's it.
Thank you, Don. Okay, and Amy at the other end of the table, way down there. She's from Virginia Tech and an engineer.
That's right. And I learned this morning that us engineers are not aware that we have emotions, so I'm working on that. My work focuses mainly on drinking water and drinking water exposures, and I really enjoyed the presentations this morning, and I felt like there's this parallel, and we really need to be doing the same thing with our tap water, that we really don't know much about what's happening, especially at the tap. And of course, water is so essential for everything that we do, drinking and bathing and cooking. Now, there's an issue in terms of the regulatory framework that our municipal water supply is regulated up to the property line. And then after it crosses the property line and enters your home and plumbing, it's really up to the homeowner to be responsible for the water quality there. And that's tricky because, well, that's where the water quality tends to deteriorate, because it sits stagnant and warm, and there's surface area and all sorts of complexities and biofilms. but that's also where the exposure happens. And then exposure is not just drinking the water. We call it drinking water, but we use it for all sorts of things, obviously showering, but we put it in humidifiers and things like that. And what we're finding is that the real exposures to be concerned about are actually inhaling aerosols and vapors and those things. And there's also interest in what colonizes your skin. And meanwhile, our drinking water regulations are set up for gastrointestinal pathogens. So we did a great job tackling cholera and typhoid at the turn of the century with our municipal water systems. But now we have a new enemy in things like Legionnaire's disease, Mycobacteria avium. So these are organisms that actually grow in the plumbing in the home. They can be in the shower head, and they're things that will infect your lungs and cause disease. And for sure, there's a personal factor there where it would be really helpful. For example, immunocompromised people are much more susceptible to these diseases, and so it'd be really helpful for them to know that these things are in their water and to take measures. They could flush the water, they could drink bottled water, they could take a bath instead of a shower to reduce the aerosol exposures. And so there's a real need in that area. And right now, this is the top source of drinking water outbreak are these diseases associated with inhalation of aerosols. And so I don't see a lot going on there. I see some movement. I think the National Academies is going to have a study section on Legionella. And Emory hosted a expert workshop to bridge this gap between public health and engineering. And I think this personal monitoring should really be at the forefront. We've done a little bit of work at Virginia Tech. I think most of you have heard about Flint, and it was mentioned this morning, and I was part of the broader team that Mark Edwards led up and our students, and so I was involved with the microbiology aspect. So this is an example where citizens are a resource, right? They knew something was wrong with their water. It was obvious, but they weren't listened to. I mean, they turned to the authorities, and there were reasons that the authorities involved did not respond and help them because they knew they were responsible. So this is an example where I think empowering individuals with data can really help avoid the Flints of the future. There's definitely an environmental justice aspect. But not just the data. I think we need scientists involved that are trained and in the risk communication and that can help them and can help understand what the data means. So, if this vision of having sensors in our water supply is realized, we're going to need to be in there with them because it's pretty traumatic when something like this happens. And so as far as, what motivates people to get involved, I think it's a prime example. When it affects you, when you're sick, your hair is falling out, your child is lead poisoned, you're motivated to get involved. And we need to be able to have a mechanism to answer the call when citizens reach out. And I think that's definitely not there when it comes to our water supply. Now, on the other side of things, so lead we know is toxic, right? We've known that since the time of the Romans, yet it still can be so complicated. On the other side is this microbiome aspect that I've been working on. So there's an example of where it's emerging science, and we're not as certain about how the microbiome in our water will affect our microbiome. But I think that's also a very interesting and important area to look at. So I've been working with the Sloan Foundation. They have this microbiome of the built environment program. And so the idea is As we saw this morning, we're learning how important our microbiome is to our health. We're spending most of our time indoors. How's that shaping our microbiome? And specifically, how is our water shaping our microbiome? And so some of the citizens that get involved in that kind of research, it's more of a traditional citizen science, like a hobby. It's interesting. I wonder what my microbiome is and what that can say about my health. But for sure, there's also a grassroots need. And so in the example in Flint, I got involved because people had rashes, and they were very painful. People still have rashes. And this is definitely one where there is a personal susceptibility role that is not clear. Why do some people get a rash and others don't? And so I think there's a lot of opportunity here in the drinking water exposure aspect.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Let me ask everybody here, okay? I know you're sitting there listening, but let me engage you for a moment. How many of you have actually personally taken an environmental exposure type test? Just raise your hands. Okay, I thought it would be more actually in this crowd, but let me focus in on the panel and ask you all that same question, and also what motivated you. I mean, it may have been research, but if there's a personal motivation, and then I'm going to ask you about the people who actually do this. And all of you mentioned some reasons, but especially this kind of crazy community, and I can talk about myself, but I already told you why I do it. Anyway, Phil, you raise your hand.
It was very simple. I was taking the students and postdocs in my training program to a lab visit at a metals lab, and they had graciously consented to do mercury tests. So they clipped hair. And by the time we had finished looking at some of the equipment and looking at some of the protocols they did there, they had put the stuff into a direct mercury analyzer and came back with the results. And I was much higher than anybody else of my students or postdocs, which surprised me because I don't eat a lot of big fish. So, but that was the main impetus, just a very simple thing. And if we were all doing it together, I had to do it.
Did it change your life?
No, it didn't. I mean, I still don't eat a lot of big fish. I like small fish.
That's interesting, though, how you might have been exposed to that. So, Dawn?
Well, it depends on what you mean by exposure, but the closest I came was the indoor PM 2.5 measure, and it kind of hit a wall. I mean, you figure out that when you burn a chicken in the oven, it's going to spike, and you sort of get sensitized and learn really, what's going on there. But at a certain point, the question I was more concerned about is actually I live in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood, and there are a lot of tear downs of very old buildings, and I was interested to see, if I put it next to an open window, would it do anything? And then I came to the realization that I'd need a much bigger deployment than what I had. and that's what brought me to the point of view I have now.
Okay. Amy?
I haven't done it, so sign me up. Sounds interesting.
I didn't see your hand go up. So, okay. So let's talk a little bit about motivation. I mean, having done a lot of these tests, one of the first things that I found out actually was that I don't have a lot of really bad things. In fact, I don't have almost all bad things. And when I first got genetically tested, everybody said, "Oh my God, what do you have?" And I was like, "I don't have much." And that made me very boring, I think, as a research subject. And I was constantly an experimental man trying to get people to actually test me, because everybody wants to get the anomaly over here, right, if you're a researcher. But keeping that in mind, and especially since most of us are healthy, but we need to understand healthy people, why you stay healthy, to understand people that have deleterious impacts with environmental exposure. So how do we motivate people, and what motivates people? And you all talked about that a little bit, but especially these extreme testers, and then how do we motivate people that aren't?
Stab at that. I'm not sure if motivation per se is the real issue here, in the sense of, so the people I worked with, were quite happy to participate, really eager actually to participate, some out of curiosity, right? Some because, you know, Fitbit's a fun thing to use. And, you know, and they, you know, this is the kind of place where people know that people get sick, right? And they have their suspicions and we're highly motivated in many ways. But it was notable that the air quality sensing that they already had and actually fought rather hard to get, no one was looking at, right? So you have this website that communicates, effectively or not, what's going on in the air, and it turns out that there's a certain amount of, like, nobody's sitting there hitting the refresh button, right? So there's a certain, I think we need to distinguish between, you know, willingness and interest in general, willingness and interest in sort of doing the collection, but also somebody's got to do the data labor. And that is sort of, that's harder. Like, it doesn't just automatically arrive and get looked at. And I think that's the bigger challenge, even with highly motivated people.
Yeah.
If I can jump in, the interpretation and it is going to be really key. And one of the issues that happened in Flint is this group Water Defense moved in, like, oh, here's this community that has need, and wow, we have this great sensor, if you want to call it that, called the water bug, and you put this sponge in your bathtub and it's going to tell you about all the chemicals in your water. And the problem is it's not scientifically based at all and just basically a random data generator. And it's causing real harm because, you know, people are traumatized and trying to figure out who they can trust, and now they're looking to these folks like, wait a minute, there's all these other chemicals in my water. And it's like, well, did you use nail polish remover today? You know, it probably picked that up from there. You know, there's no control. And a direct consequence of that is that people stopped washing their hands. You know, even at the point when it was, you know, highly contaminated. I mean, for most people, washing your hands is going to be fine. And now the water quality's improved, but people don't wash their hands. Well, now, guess what? There was another outbreak of Shigella, and that's an outbreak that happens when you don't wash your hands. So I think we'll have to really, you know, if we really encourage people to use these technologies, we have to stay in there and help with the interpretation. And so I think there can be various levels of that, like with web apps and basic interpretation. But is anyone doing anything like a Ask a Scientist type? You know, they used to have this Ask a Nurse hotline. Like, I mean, can there be a Ask a Scientist type hotline?
Well, so as a response to that, whenever we do any of these report backs, we always have somebody on tap. I mean, it's usually the toxicologist in the program, but sometimes it's also a physician. So I think that's always important because even though we don't think people would panic, we've never seen it, we just think it's the right protocol to have somebody who's there who can give the expert response. I want to say something more about motivation and to use a different term and think more about community organizing and community capacity, because in Northern California, we worked with an environmental justice group, Communities for a Better Environment, and motivation was not even the problem because they'd been working for many years on a lot of community issues, mainly around the Chevron refinery, which is one of the largest in the country and certainly the largest west of the Mississippi. So there was a history there, and that makes it really different. You don't have to motivate people. In fact, you have to kind of keep them away because they went door to door in the entire study area and knocked on every single household. And because they were known faces there, they had done a lot of work in those neighborhoods before. And they were overwhelmed with people saying, the reason they went door to door was to say, you may be contacted at random to be part of a study in the next several months. So please, do that if you're asked. And they all said, no, sign me up right now. I mean, everybody wanted to volunteer. They wanted more information because they knew what was on their doorstep already, what was, just across the fence line. And what was interesting was because we had a community advisory board that took a community-based participatory approach to this, they said eventually, you have to allow a certain number of those. If you're going to have 40 in your sample, allocate half of those to volunteers, and people understand that the sampling frame is still okay. We did that, and as it turned out, a few of them got eaten up by the random sampling anyway, but we wound up with about 12 or 13 volunteers out of the whole thing, and we never got criticized in peer review in a lot of different journals for doing that. But that's an example of reframing motivation to be, serving a community that's already very affected and that wants to do this. They want more help.
Yeah, I wonder if once these technologies get better refined and some of the information, if the vast majority of people will have passive measurements. In fact, we won't even know what's going on, on wearables, environmental monitoring. There's already some of that going on. Because I'm not going to ask you all, put you on the spot, but I often ask how many people have used a Fitbit and then how many people are using it now. And it turns out a lot of people raise their hands to the first question, and then a lot of people raise it as not using it, for the second. And so clearly, unless you do have, obviously if you're in a community that's having an environmental, impact of some sort, you're highly motivated, and I've done a lot of stories on them. But I think eventually we're going to have to figure out how to just make this sort of seamless, and you get a red flag when something pops up. But I want to come back to something that Amy was starting to talk about, which is, in the community of citizens, there's a vast amount of confusion about where the science is and what they can actually learn. And you get people who become zealots on certain pseudo technologies that aren't even real. And this must concern all of you in the scientific community a great deal. It's partly this open science, citizen science versus a more refined academic approach. But how do we deal with that? And are we dealing with it?
Well, I feel like the reality is it is happening. People are going to get this kind of information, and we can't control everything. I think as a scientific community, we still go about science as we do, and through the scientific process and peer review, and but also just have patience in working with people, patience and respect, because in a lot of ways it's going to be a good thing, because it'll help people to value science because it's something that personally affects them and that they're interested in, and I think we should respect that.
If I could just interject, our work was very much of the mentality of what we're doing is we're trying to see if there's something to look at, and that's very different from this is something that we're going to attempt to publish and claim as once and for all science. And I think that framing actually communicates very well. It was very clear to all the participants involved, and there might come a point when we get someone like Phil's team on board or not. But if I could just also respond to your interjection about passive sensing and people who don't necessarily think that they're going to get involved until something happens. I think that's actually, the people in this room can make an important intervention in that right now. And that's this. The consumer devices that are going into homes today are built, in the way that I said, to communicate something specifically, and as a result, firms really don't believe they're in the business of data interoperability, right? They will not put a developer on the task of making it possible to export data, right? But when they know there's research value, and when they get calls and emails from folks in this room, that can change, right? They do respond to that, particularly if somebody's seeing value in their data. So I would very much encourage folks to do that, because if our technical system coheres in a certain direction, that data's lost to everyone here.
One thing that we need to do, of course, is to validate low-cost community sensors with other highly technical ones. One of the colleagues in my institute is using a very inexpensive device to look for hydrogen sulfide in fracking affected areas, and is basically using film paper because the silver nitrate tarnishes when exposed. And in a sense, you put all of the colored pieces of this on a map, and you get what's essentially a very qualitative approach. But it does, as Dawn said, it leads you to seek other questions. But at some point, you actually get devices that are going to be equivalent or close to it. I was very impressed when Edmund talked earlier about the 0.84 correlation between the community monitor and the regulatory EPA monitors. I think we're getting to a point where there are increasing number of low-cost devices that are out there, and that will be scientifically very valid So I think we need to develop more of them, and obviously we always need to validate them against the more official ones, but remembering also that those official ones, like let's say a Jerome meter, is going to give you that average over time, over the day, and it's not going to tell you when anything spikes. So one of the benefits about a lot of the community monitoring is it in fact does look at all the spikes.
Yeah, it's actually kind of an exciting area. Let's look at it that way. There's a sort of gap in between, like I said, the higher level scientific community, academic community, and all this self-experimentation. And, you know, being out in Silicon Valley and all that, there's certainly people stepping in from an entrepreneurial standpoint, trying to fill in that gap. I think we need to really think about that, and I'd love to see some academics actually even specialize in that interface, and I know some of you all are. And we need a lot more of that. In fact, a second part of that question is, you do have the open science, citizen science movement, and you know, again, out in my part of the country, there's we're a long way from Washington, and you know, people are very suspicious about any kind of regulations. 23andMe got sort of sideswiped by that, probably more than that, and you know, putting out. I've been writing stories on them for years, you know, putting out some data that was great, some data that was, you know, probably preliminary. And the FDA eventually came and shut down part of what the information they were giving out. And I can see that happening with environmental data as well. So how do we bridge that gap where you have, you know, I guess on the regulatory side, and I know you all aren't regulators, but you know, you study this and the ethics of it. You know, how do we balance, you know, traditional regulatory system, you know, which does have, you know, pretty strict guidelines, rules about how you over efficacy and safety. You know, do we need to redesign that? How do we, you know, not discourage the slightly crazy person, you know, out in California that wants to try something? As long as they're not hurting themselves. But how do we address that?
I'm just going to take a wild guess and then you can shoot me down, but I think it'll be an iterative process that folks will try it and then find out some aspects are wrong, and then regulations will come in.
And maybe I should ask, since you all sort of study this, you know, how do the people that are taking these tests, how would they like to see that sort of safety layer or that efficacy layer work? Or maybe they don't want it at all.
Well, I mean, I don't know in a direct way, but what I do know is that, you know, the history of, there's a very long history of people participating in regulatory and research processes, right? If we look at sort of the early days of HIV, what people were doing was, you know, self-treating, sometimes wildly ineffective, sometimes crazy, and sometimes interesting, and really became a part of the process, right? So I think we can't be afraid of uncertainty, right? But we have to deal with it, and we have to sort of talk about it openly, and so that's the nature of. I mean, I think iteration is absolutely correct, but iteration with people involved, right?
That's a really great point, and you know, Steve Epstein wrote a wonderful book called Impure Science, in which he talks about the struggle of the AIDS activists who eventually got put on panels that were reviewing grants and doing policy. And this was also true in terms of a lot of breast cancer research. The Department of Defense's breast cancer program brought activists on to their review panels because they understood that they had really learned a lot of information and that they could not only be good scientific critics on the review panel, but could also talk about the social applications and ethical implications of the science. I think that we sometimes worry too much that lay people are going to get the wrong tools in their hand and forget that scientists sometimes get the wrong tools in their hand too. And I think that we're confronted increasingly in a climate of resistance here. The state of Wyoming now prohibits people from grabbing samples on public land. I'm afraid we're going to see more of that. People may remember what happened, you know, in the Bush administration when material was taken off of the EPA website that should have been public access information. I think that there's just a lot of challenges that we have to face, particularly at times like ours, and you know, empowering citizens groups to have more tools at their disposal is just going to be increasingly necessary.
Yes, and I would love to dive more into many of these questions, but we have time for a couple questions from you. Let's start over here. Do we have a mic? Here. If anybody else has a question, maybe you could go ahead and tee up at one of the mics.
So, two comments about the regulatory side and then a question. Since I'm at the state of Connecticut and I do toxicology risk assessment, which branches over into risk management and regulation. Regarding the short-term PM monitors, and we've done measurements of short-term PM in things like train stations, and you don't have a particulate matter standard that pertains to a 15-minute spike, so, which is something that was brought up earlier. So we've seen spikes, we've seen symptoms, but they don't relate to the 24-hour PM number. And you know, it looks fine on a 24-hour basis, but the short term. So I think that regulatory-wise and our risk assessment focus is increasingly looking at other timeframes and temporality of exposure. You know, we need to make sure that our standards match how people are actually getting exposed. And I think that the new technologies will challenge us even more to go there. The question I had is, well, it's a point, and I guess the panel can feel free to respond if they want, but the Mercury study that you pointed to regarding amalgam and genetic susceptibility, of course, that had some issues because they were during urinary mercury, which could come from fish as well, but assuming that we can say that amalgam is a risk factor for a percentage of children, not all children, but you know, one of those genetic markers had a frequency of 28% in those kids. Do we allow one regulatory approach is to say, okay, there's a identifiable percentage of the population that's a risk factor for, so we should stop using amalgam to protect everybody. The other is to say, and this comes from occupational health, is to say, well, if we can identify those that are at risk, amalgam's fine for those that can handle it, and just identify those that should not get amalgam. And so I think it's a philosophical, ethical question of what do we do with that information regulatory-wise, and in terms of products, exposures, et cetera. Thanks.
Thank you. And yeah, just to quickly comment on that, obviously this is a new way to look at toxic exposure. You know, right now we deal in means and averages. If you can identify in a solid scientific way a segment of the population that's at risk, say through a genetic test, you know, that obviously changes how we regulate it, how, you know, policy issues. I mean, you know, in the same project that I described earlier, we're also looking at lead and arsenic and some other heavy metals. It'd be interesting to have that test in Flint, Michigan. I mean, right now we're treating all children as if they were exposed, you know, and have the same risk factors, and that's probably not true. And you could delegate, you know, resources better. But that question of whether you would allow kids who are not at risk to have amalgam fillings is an interesting one. I mean, you know, do you allow that exposure on that basis? So anyway, other questions? Yes.
If I could just be furtherly provocative, along the same lines, and this is not intended to be a false dichotomy by any means, but as we're talking about individual susceptibility, and it's come up again and again, and the notion of precision and personalized medicine, so too doesn't it bring us down a path to say, well, we have to be concerned about controlling exposures just for some and not for others? And doesn't it potentially take us away from investing as much energy as possible in ridding the environment as a whole from pollution?
Yeah, no, I have thoughts on that, but maybe the panel would like to answer.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of examples. A lot of environmental justice groups, particularly involving Alaska Natives and Native Americans, worry that their whole populations will be stigmatized if certain variants are found there, and they've got good reason for that history. We also have other kinds of histories too. I mean, women working in lead factories were taken out of production line jobs and put into office jobs at a third of the salary in order to not do anything at a structural level to control the emissions in the whole plant. Or peach growers in Georgia, when they found out that there were sterility problems in men from DBCP fumigants on the peaches, they were just told, you know, this, for people who have a religious reason to avoid birth control, you should just keep working here. I mean, that may seem extreme, but, you know, this was like on the front page of the New York Times, you know, several decades ago. So we don't want to have individual solutions to things that should be collective action. We shouldn't have to spend all of our days reading labels in the supermarket and the drugstore when we know that the same product can be produced in Europe without those phthalates and parabens as it is here. So I want us to focus always on that community empowerment and collective and structural action.
Any other comments on that? I mean, you're starting to get into the personalization, which we were hearing about some this morning. And, you know, I call it the tyranny of the average, actually, you know, which is what most science is based on, especially in exposure. And we clearly, it's another one of those interesting gaps. And again, I tend to look at those things as opportunities. And, you know, when I'm out with the entrepreneurs and all that, say, you know, stop making a company that's going to do the 600th app, you know, to measure glucose for diabetics. You know, take on one of these new topics that others haven't dealt with. But anyway, I think we probably better wind it up. My light is going to turn red momentarily in 3 seconds. So I want to thank the panel and thank you all for listening. And we'll all be around if you have any more questions. So thank you very much.